He was tormented by a relentless facial tic, a physical manifestation of the internal agony. Admitting, "I wish I could just die for a moment so I wouldn't have to pretend to be Jim Carrey anymore." This Jim Carrey was a fabrication, a mask built to make the world laugh in films like Ace Ventura or The Mask, while the man behind it quietly disintegrated after every performance. Each electrifying, radiant smile for the camera was a lie, concealing a soul collapsing under an impossible weight of despair. His childhood was a crucible of pain. A father who effectively abandoned them when his career failed. A mother drowning in financial hardship and her own physical and mental torment. He learned far too young to brace himself against the relentless blows of adversity. As a Hollywood star, the suffocating pressure of fame and the crushing expectation to always be on hollowed him out, pushing him to the very edge of existence, where he wrestled with thoughts of ending his own life. While the world saw a symbol of pure joy, the real Jim was drowning, caught in a violent, invisible tide of pain and profound loneliness that scoured away any trace of happiness. He fought a harrowing, decades-long battle with severe depression, clinging to antidepressants merely to survive the long, bleak, gray days, every broken relationship, every sudden, devastating loss of a loved one, and the ceaseless demand to be the funny man for millions, felt like knives carving into his soul. But the final, unbearable tragedies were the ones that truly shattered him: the death of his brother John in 2021, and his sister Rita in 2024. These were the blows that finally drove him into a solitary exile, where only painting and meditation offered a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. He manufactured laughter for others, but in the silence, he wept alone, drowning in an ocean of private pain few could ever comprehend. Is that dazzling smile real, or just a fractured mask hiding a bleeding heart? The answers are buried in this story. Contrary to the brilliant facade Jim Carrey projected, he was a man locked in a desperate struggle with the shadows of his depression and the raw, unhealed wounds of a fractured childhood. The applause and the blinding lights only served to mask the violent, internal currents pulling him down into an abyss, unseen by all. At the zenith of his fame, as his name became synonymous with legendary comedy, Carrey felt an immense, echoing void opening in his soul. Through the 1990s and 2000s, he relied on Prozac. He confessed this publicly in 2004. "I used Prozac for a very long time. It helped temporarily but created a low-grade despair." He existed in a muted gray fog. Everything was okay, but there were no real highs. During those agonizing days, his very body seemed to reject the performance, screaming, "I don't want to live as this character anymore." Depression, he explained, wasn't just sadness, it was the profound, soul-deep exhaustion of upholding a fake persona society demanded. "When I tried to be Jim Carrey, I was depressed. That constant performance was killing him." The depression clung to him for decades, a suffocating shroud, until he finally turned toward meditation and silence to confront the wreckage of himself. He grasped a paintbrush, using colors to bleed out the emotions words couldn't touch. Each stroke was a tear, each canvas a sigh, a desperate attempt to release the agony accumulated over a lifetime. To understand this tragedy, one must return to the beginning, to the painful, fractured childhood that left his heart shattered with wounds that refused to heal. Born in 1962, Jim's childhood was a grim landscape of extreme poverty. His father, Percy, provided an unstable existence. His mother, Kathleen, was a prisoner in her own body, ravaged by chronic pain, addicted to painkillers, and sinking into a deep depression. She was often bedridden, speaking casually of her own death, a terrifying normality for a young boy. Though physically present, her emotional absence was a gaping wound. Even though she was always in the house, Jim shared, addiction itself felt like abandonment. A chilling fear of death haunted him. His mother's casual talk of mortality terrified him, seeding a constant anxiety that she would vanish. He remembered locking himself in the bathroom, sobbing, consumed by the fear that she would die. Growing up beside his siblings, John, Patricia, and Rita, he felt the crushing precariousness and profound loneliness of their fragile family unit. At 10, in a desperate plea for a different life, he wrote to Carol Burnett, The template reply he received was a rare flicker of hope in an overwhelming darkness. Then, when Jim was 12, the floor fell out, his father lost his job, and the family plummeted into abject hardship. They were forced to live in a Volkswagen van, then a makeshift tent on the shores of Lake Ontario. We lived in that van for 8 months. Jim recalled, his voice thick with the memory. Every morning I saw other people going to work and we didn't even know where we would go. That period instilled a chilling helplessness. At 15, Jim began working, cleaning floors at Titan Wheels. Enduring grueling night shifts, exhausted, he clung to the dream. Even as he battled undiagnosed dyslexia, he was a quiet, isolated child. The trauma of homelessness left a permanent scar, a persistent, gnawing fear of losing everything. They were ghosts, moving constantly, their world shrinking to the confines of that old van or the damp tent where he and his brother John lived for months. The boy who once made his family laugh became mute with despair. But Percy, his father, who had seen his own dreams die, refused to let his son's light extinguish. At 15, Jim stood at the Yak Yaks Comedy Club. The response was brutal: boos, whistles, and cruel, mocking laughter. The first public humiliation shattered him. Yet, instead of surrendering, Jim retreated into silence, spending years obsessively refining his craft. He finally landed a small gig. It was then that fate intervened. Rodney Dangerfield saw him and invited him to tour. With a tattered suitcase and a one-way ticket, Jim left for Hollywood, a city that nurtures dreams but just as easily devours the dreamers. He didn't know he was walking into a place where he would find fame, but also lose himself completely in a vortex of loneliness. In 1983, his chance came. A tryout for The Tonight Show. He poured his soul onto the stage. The response was a chilling silence. The call came: "We're sorry." His first great dream was pulverized. He landed a sitcom, but casting directors relentlessly rejected him. Overacting. Not marketable. Then, a desperate role. A drug-addicted rock singer who dies in a Clint Eastwood film. Jim submitted a tape of pure mania. "Well, that's it," he sighed. "My career is over." But Eastwood laughed and said, "I like him." Success was a distant mirage. Every night, he'd drive up Mulholland Drive, gazing at the glittering expanse of Los Angeles, whispering a desperate vow: "One day all these lights will spell my name." Around 1990, he made a defiant gesture of faith. He wrote himself a check for $10 million for acting services rendered, and carried that folded, fading paper in his wallet every day. It wasn't just a dream, it was a lifeline. Soon, In Living Color called. In the 1990s, Hollywood comedy belonged to titans. No one saw Jim Carrey coming. Then, Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. Producers braced for a bomb. But Jim seized control, demanding, "The entire character must be built my way." He twisted the role into something manic. And, alrighty then, became a global phenomenon. Critics savaged the film, but audiences howled. A star was born. Yet, that laughter was a hollow echo for Jim. The pain was relentless, just as his career was igniting. His mother Kathleen died in 1991. He hadn't yet achieved the success he craved to show her. 3 years later, just as he finally tasted real fame, his father Percy, the man who pushed him onto the stage, also passed away. "Dad, I made it, but you're not here to see it," Jim whispered, his heart torn in two at his father's grave. The monumental success of Dumb and Dumber meant nothing. It couldn't fill the gaping void. Shattered, Jim buried himself in work. The only anesthetic he knew: Ace Ventura 2, Batman Forever, Liar Liar. He proved his depth in The Truman Show and Man on the Moon. But the accolades felt empty. He was the king of comedy, yet he was utterly alone in his grief. He dominated the 2000s with The Grinch and Bruce Almighty. But the pinnacle was Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind in 2004. As Joel Barish, he wasn't performing, he was revealing, a profound, emotional, and broken man. But just as the world acknowledged his depth, his personal tragedies continued their relentless assault. In 2005, a devastating blow: his nephew, Marty Fournier, was killed at 25 in a horrific car accident. Marty, his sister Rita's only son, was on his way to rehearse a song titled, "In a Cruel Twist of Fate, Tiny Tragedies," when he was killed instantly. The sudden, violent loss shattered the family. Jim was consumed by a deep, silent grief. Family is everything. A friend shared. Losing them is like losing part of your soul. He retreated again, channeling his anguish into somber, dark paintings. His private life was a wasteland of troubled, failed relationships. His first marriage ended in 1995. A year later, his marriage to Lauren Holly imploded in less than 12 months. Engagements and long-term relationships all dissolved, leaving him searching. But in 2015, Jim faced the most harrowing event of his private life. His ex-girlfriend, Catriona White, was found dead in her home. A suicide. She left a letter addressed to him. Words that would haunt him forever. "You did good by me, but being with you destroyed me as a person." Jim was broken. "I couldn't believe it. She wrote that I destroyed her. It weighed heavily on my heart." In the midst of his shock and grief, Catriona's family sued him, launching horrific accusations that he provided illegal drugs, transmitted STDs, and emotionally abused her. Jim was stunned, forced to defend himself while mourning the woman he loved. "They're trying to exploit this pain to profit from me." Despite the accusations, he fulfilled her final wish, traveling to her small Irish hometown to serve as a pallbearer, his face a mask of anguish as he carried her casket. "She was a true Irish flower," he whispered, "too sensitive for this world." Though the charges were eventually dismissed, the trauma was permanent. The agonizing lawsuit plunged Jim into his deepest depression yet. He announced his retirement, vanishing from the public eye. He isolated himself, painting works filled with rage. "I'm no longer Jim Carrey," he confessed in a rare, haunted 2017 interview. "I don't know who I am." The depression enveloped him, and all the childhood terrors, the fear of abandonment, the fear of loss, resurfaced, tormenting him in the night. Fate was not finished. In 2021, his brother John died at 60. The brother who had shared the tent with him in those dark, homeless nights was gone. This loss drove him deeper into solitude. Then, the peak of all tragedy, the final, crushing blow, came in 2024. His sister Rita, who had also endured that early poverty with him, suddenly passed away. Jim was shattered beyond repair. The Carrey family, once huddled together for warmth in a van, was decimated. Now, only his sister Patricia remained. "I laughed to hide the pain," he confided to a friend, his voice hollow. "But now, I have no strength left." The paintings he produced in this period were devoid of light, reflecting a soul utterly wounded. Today, Jim Carrey lives a quiet, solitary life, clinging to meditation and art as anchors. He has abandoned the antidepressants, the coffee, the alcohol, and the character of Jim Carrey. He lives alone, finding in painting a way to bleed his pain onto the canvas. A desperate means of healing. Jim Carrey's life is not a comedy. It is a journey choked with tragedy. A man who gave the world laughter while his own world was relentlessly torn apart. Has the funniest man alive ever truly found a moment's peace? Or is he forever that terrified boy, locked in the bathroom, crying, waiting for the next loss? The answer to that question is a resounding, heartbreaking affirmative. He is not only still that terrified boy, he is that boy amplified by a lifetime of unimaginable loss. A boy who built a fortress of fame and fortune only to find himself a prisoner within it. The man who taught the world to laugh, alrighty then, cannot find a single thing to be alright about in the wreckage of his own existence. The mask he perfected, the manic caricature of Jim Carrey, was not just a performance, it was a desperate, high-voltage shield. But the shield, subjected to decades of relentless battery, has finally cracked, revealing the raw, pulverized human being underneath, who no longer has the strength, or the will, to pretend. The public glimpses of this disintegration were horrifying, but none more so than the ordeal surrounding Catriona White. Her death in 2015 was not just a tragedy, it was the beginning of a public vivisection. The agonizing content of her suicide note, "Being with you destroyed me as a person," was a poisoned arrow that pierced the very core of his being. For a man whose entire life was a performance designed to bring joy To be accused of being the cause of someone's ultimate destruction was an unbearable verdict. And then came the lawsuit. The world watched as he was publicly, clinically, and ruthlessly accused of the most vile acts, giving her STDs, introducing her to a life of cocaine and prostitutes, and being the monster who handed her the pills that ended her life. Imagine the psychological torment. Every accusation, whether true or false, was a fresh layer of cement, burying him alive. The man who had hidden his own pain to make others feel good was now being defined as a walking plague, a source of lethal contagion. He had to sit in sterile legal offices, his grief eclipsed by allegations, his mourning period transformed into a battle for his own reputation. When he flew to Ireland, his face a hollow mask of grief, and carried her casket on his shoulder, the cameras clicked, and the whispers followed him. Was this a man grieving, or a killer performing his final act of deception? That ambiguity, that public stain, was a wound that could never heal. It confirmed his deepest childhood terror, that he was toxic, that his very presence brought ruin, that everyone he loved would, eventually, leave him. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, a hollow victory that brought no peace. The damage was done. The Jim Carrey persona was irredeemably shattered. This was the trigger for his public retreat, the period he euphemistically called a deep rest. But it was not rest. It was a complete psychological collapse. He said in that haunted 2017 interview, "I'm no longer Jim Carrey. I don't know who I am." This was not a philosophical platitude. It was the terrified confession of a man who had stared into the void and realized the character he had played for 30 years had been vaporized, leaving nothing behind. The mask was gone, and he didn't recognize the face underneath. He retreated into the opulent fortress of his Brentwood mansion. But that mansion, with its pools and tennis courts, was not a home, it was a bunker. It was the adult, multi-million-dollar version of the Volkswagen van. A place to hide from a world that had proven to be relentlessly, spectacularly cruel. He vanished, and in that self-imposed isolation, the real Jim Carrey, the one who wasn't a performer, but a raw, exposed nerve of anger and pain, finally emerged, not on a stage, but on a canvas. His painting, which he suddenly pursued with a manic, obsessive energy, was not a hobby, it was an exorcism. The art he produced was not serene landscapes or gentle portraits. It was a torrent of chaotic, often grotesque, and deeply angry imagery. He painted screaming faces, distorted figures, and searing political cartoons that dripped with contempt and rage. This was where his pain went. It was the physical manifestation of the screams he couldn't utter. The vibrant, almost violent colors were the antithesis of the low-grade despair of his Prozac years. This was high-grade, high-voltage agony, poured onto canvas because his body could no longer contain it. He was not healing, he was venting. He was showing the world the monster it had created, the Fire Marshal Bill of his own soul, a figure perpetually burning in a fire of his own trauma. Alongside this artistic explosion came a dive into spirituality. But this too was not the gentle journey of a man finding himself. It was the desperate scramble of a drowning man searching for any piece of driftwood. He spoke of consciousness, of the universe, of the idea that Jim Carrey was a construct that never really existed. This wasn't enlightenment, it was a profound, necessary act of dissociation. To survive the unbearable pain of being Jim Carrey, the man whose mother was an addict, whose father was a failure, whose lovers died, whose family was cursed, he had to intellectually annihilate himself. He had to convince himself that he wasn't the one suffering, because he didn't exist. It was the only way to endure the reality that his life had become an unending nightmare. He wasn't woke, he was shattered into a million philosophical pieces, trying to reassemble them into a narrative that didn't end with a bullet. And just as he was attempting to build this fragile new identity, this person who is not a person, the universe, which had always seemed to take a sadistic pleasure in his suffering, delivered its final, most devastating blows. The losses of his mother, his father, and his nephew were agonizing. The loss of Catriona was a psychological amputation, but the deaths of his brother, John, in 2021, and his sister, Rita, in 2024, were an existential erasure. This was a different, more profound kind of grief. John and Rita were not just siblings. They were the only other witnesses. They were the only two people on planet Earth who truly knew what it felt like to be in that van. They were the only ones who knew the specific chill of the tent in Charles Daly Park. The precise sound of their father's defeated sigh. The smell of their mother's sick room. They were the co-survivors of the wreckage. Their shared memory was the last frayed tether connecting Jim to his own origin. When they died, that tether was severed. He was now, in the most absolute sense, alone. He was the sole remaining survivor of his own past. The family he had tried to save with his comedy. The family whose poverty had lit the fire of his ambition. Was gone. He had made the $10 million. And then $100 million more. But there was no one left to give it to. He had won the game, only to find that the prize was an empty house filled with ghosts. The loss of John and Rita was the final chapter in the tragedy. The one that confirmed his deepest, most primal fear from that locked bathroom. Everyone leaves. He was, at last, truly and completely abandoned. So when we see him now, returning to the screen in films like Sonic the Hedgehog, it is impossible to watch him with the same joy. We are no longer watching a comedian. We are watching a ghost perform a pantomime of his former self. The manic energy is there. The rubber-faced contortions are present. But the eyes are hollow. The laughter he generates is an echo from a bygone era. From a man who no longer exists. His comeback is not a triumph. It's a tragedy in its final act. It's the ultimate proof that the mask is all anyone ever wanted. And so he, out of habit or perhaps contractual obligation, has dutifully put the mask back on over the void. Jim Carrey's life is the ultimate Faustian bargain. A story of a boy who prayed for the power to make the world laugh. And the universe granted his wish, but demanded in payment his mother, his father, his nephew, his lovers, his brother, his sister, and, finally, his own soul. He is a man who achieved a level of success that is statistically impossible. Yet he is arguably one of the most tragic figures of our time. He is a multi-millionaire living in a fortress of solitude, a spiritual seeker who had to destroy his own identity to survive it, and a comedy legend who has forgotten what joy feels like. He is, and perhaps always will be, that terrified little boy, only now, there is no one left to cry for, and no one left to hear him.